Xin chào các em. Well, welcome back to our drama lesson. Today I have a special guest, Quý. So Quý is one of our students from advanced drama class, and today I have him here today because hopefully he will have some good questions and some challenges if there is any. Uh, so today's lesson with Quý is going to be about the Four Noble Truth. Okay, and that's essentially one of the core teaching that you may have learned from school, right? Like, 'cause if you go to American school, uh, they may not teach the whole Buddhist Dharma, but they surely will teach. What else do they teach? Noble, Four Noble Truth, and what else?
Eightfold Path, and a lot of Buddhist history.
Okay, so the basics. Okay, today we're gonna go just a little bit deeper, but not as deep as it should be because we don't have a lot of time. My intent is to have just a 10 minutes video maximum. Longer than that will be too boring. So, so let me ask you this. So, in the Dharma, the way that we learn, how many parts are there to the Dharma?
There are three.
Three parts. Okay. So we make it in three parts because it is easier for us to study and learn why it is three. So can you name the three parts? The first part is what?
Oh, like those three parts:
Yeah.
acknowledge, balance, and correction.
Okay. So the first part is acknowledge of the three marks of existence. What are the three marks of existence?
Impermanence, non-self, and disorder.
Okay, so in anything that you learn from life, from other religion, or even from Buddhism, if it is against the three mark of existence, then it is not uh, consistent with natural law. So three marks of existence are impermanence, non-self, and disorder, right? Okay, and so that's the acknowledgement part. What is the second part of the Dharma?
Balance.
Balance. Okay. So the balance part is the is how you lead your life in a balanced manner, so you don't become uh, eccentric, meaning you are not in the center, right? Eccentric. The
Mm-hmm.
eccentric is off center, and so sometimes you're off center, meaning you are uh, socially awkward, or you have addiction, or you have issues. So whenever you're off balance, you're gonna have some issues, right? So what is the last part of the Dharma?
Corrections.
Correction. All right. So correction is very essential because if you lead a normal life, maybe you never need to have corrections. But whenever you have the need for correction, then you have to tap into the Buddha teaching of the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and most importantly, the 12 dependent origins of suffering. Okay, because if you don't have that, it will be tough to practice the Four Noble Truths. So today is going to be a brief discussion about the Four Noble Truths. Okay, so if you ever attend a Buddhist seminar, they will talk about the three categories of suffering. When I was younger, it was hard for me to uh, connect why there are three. But as I uh, learn from others and do some practicing myself, I realized that the three uh, category of suffering actually came from the three marks of existence. So, for example, so what is the first mark of existence?
Impermanence.
Impermanence. So impermanence. Um, so one category of suffering that came from that is what they call uh, suffering of change. So if you're not accustomed to change, or you don't like change, getting old, somebody died, you lost something, uh, some people can cope better, some people cannot. So suffering of change is one of the category of suffering. Okay, so that's in Vietnamese it is called hoại khổ. That means suffering of change. What is the second mark of existence?
Non-self.
Non-self. Okay, so non-self meaning that you're not yourself uh, all the time. You grow, constantly growing, and also when you get older, you are less of your younger self, right? You keep changing just like everything else, and so the second type of suffering that came from that second mark of existence is called hành khổ. It means formation of mental and physical habits. So when you forming something, if you form bad habits, you're gonna have suffering from that bad habits, either physical or mental. Okay, so that is the second category of suffering. So it actually came from the second mark of existence. So what is the third mark of existence?
Disorder.
Disorder. So if you go to traditional textbook, Buddhism have the word dukkha for suffer, dukkha um, in Sanskrit. But if you want to translate that, it's very difficult to translate. Some other countries translate that differently from Vietnamese translation. So Vietnamese translation we call that khổ or suffering. In other countries like Tibet, they call that contamination or unsatisfactory, not clean, things like that. But to make dukkha uh, full and comprehensive, so we came up with a creative term for that called disorder. So it kind of encapsulate every single translation. So disorder, okay. Um, so in Vietnamese, the suffering that comes from the disorder or khổ is called dukkha or khổ, right? That means compound suffering. It came from actually the imbalance of your five attributes. So when you have physical pain, then you're also gonna have mental uh, depression because of that, and then if you live with somebody else, you're gonna cause that person pain. So it's suffering on suffering. That's why it's called dukkha. All right. Okay. So now we kind of identify where the suffering came from. It actually came from the three categories, right? Of three mark of existence. So now you know where they come from actually. All right. It's not just random. All right. Now, so how do we know when you have suffering? Do you have any idea whether another person might have suffering in their life?
Well, isn't that what the Four Noble Truths are for? Where you had to investigate if you would have suffering or not.
Okay, so so Four Noble Truth. Four Noble Truth, if you go to the textbook, it will say is the truth of suffering. The second truth is uh, the truth of the origin of suffering. And the third truth is the cessations of suffering. That means uh, the elimination of suffering. And the fourth truth is the path out of suffering. Okay, so those are the four truths. Okay, and it's hard to remember the four steps. So when I was teaching young kids the Four Noble Truths, I came up with a an acronym. The acronyms. You remember what the acronym is?
Airs.
AIR. So it has an extra S at the back. So AIRS. So air actually just spelled AIR, but because we have Four Noble Truths, so we have to add an extra S for that. So the S stands for sustained, or how do you sustain your path? So A stands for what?
Admit.
So you have to admit that you have suffering. I stand for what?
Investigate.
Investigate. So you have to investigate where the causation of your suffering come from. So the way to investigate that is to look at the 12 dependent origins of suffering. And I will kind of briefly go through them. And what is the third step? R stand for what?
Replace.
Okay, so once you identify the root cause of your suffering, right, you have to find a replacement for that uh, bad seed or bad habit with a new one. Because can you actually eliminate an atom? No, right? Because you have to change it to a different phase, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you in natural life, in human nature, is the same way. You cannot make something disappear or wish for it to disappear. You have to replace that to occupy the space and time. Otherwise, you cannot tell a person who is addicted to gambling to say, "Hey, stop gambling," or "Stop playing video games." You have to find that person something to do, right? To occupy the space, something positive, new friends, new hobbies, right? Get him out or her out the door, right? Okay. So that's the third step. Now, what is the fourth step?
Sustain.
Sustain. Okay. So if you live long enough, you probably have come across people who have addiction to alcohol or gambling, and sometimes they get help, and then after a while, many of them will relapse back to the disarray or the suffering stage because they could not sustain the path. So that we don't want that. So Buddhism, Four Noble Truths, has the four elements to deal with uh, how to identify your suffering, how to replace it, and also how to sustain it. So I'm going to go briefly over that. Okay. And anytime if you have questions, go ahead and ask. Okay. Or challenge, right? Because Buddha always said, you don't just blindly follow or listen. That he will give you the skill. It's up to you to use it or not, right? So it is hard for one to admit that he or she has a problem, right? When you look at the three category of suffering, it is sometimes hard to know where does it come from? Where does my suffering belong to? Is it part A of impermanence, which is a suffering of change, or is it part B or part C? It's hard to, but the easy way to identify that is this: you ask yourself, are you suffering mentally or physically? Is your job or your social life impacted by your suffering? That's one way of looking at it. The other way is, how about your family? Are they suffering? Even if what you do or what you're doing is not a bad thing, right? I'll give you one example. If I am too addicted to the Dharma, if I spend all my time researching and teaching or going to temple constantly and ignore my family, to me it's a good thing. But to my family, right, might not be good, right? So if either or, if either your family is suffering and you feel fine, that that means that you do have an issue on your hand. So when you have either or of the two components that are experiencing suffering, then you do have an issue that you have to deal with.
So it kind of connects to that balance thing.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So once you identify that, hey, we have an issue, then you have to sit down and look at the 12 dependence uh, uh, origins of suffering. Okay, and just gonna go briefly to what they are. There are ignorance, verbal, uh, idea, and action, habit. There are judgment. There are name and form. Six senses, the contact, sensations, uh, great craving, attachment, claim, birth, death, and also yeah, birth, death. So that those are the 12 compartments that you have to look into deeply. It takes about 2 or 3 days actually to go through that process with an individual or a family, just to make sure that you are comprehensive about the cause of the suffering. So once you actually find that, then you go and find a replacement for that. So you actually have a worksheet, right? And we sort of go through similar things last night, right? So we sat down with a worksheet and we went through, and it took a long time. How long did it take
Couple
us?
hours.
A couple hours, right? And we only went to how many categories?
Two.
Just two. See, just two categories of the 12 dependent uh, origins of suffering. Took us 2 hours, right? And we didn't even get up to three or four, just two. And then after that, you have to go to the third step of the Four Noble Truths is to find a positive replacement once you identify your issues, right? So you see now the practice of Buddhism is there, but not a lot of people take the time to sit down and actually do it. Um, so today I just want to give you a brief introduction to the Four Noble Truths. All right. So after, let's say we have done our investigation and replacement. What is the last step?
Sustain.
To sustain. So it's the path to sustain, and the path to sustain, that is the
Most difficult.
yes, yes, the eightfold path. So the eightfold path is um, what is the acronym for the eightfold path?
Visa Wharf.
Okay, so you may not know what Visa Wharf is, um, because Dharma, Buddhist Dharma is very complicated in terms of you have three of that, five of this, four of that, 12 of this. and then 8 of this and 7 of that. So many digits to remember, right? And so when I deal with kids, I like to come up with acronyms to help them remember things. So VISA WAP stand for right view. Go
Right
ahead.
intent,
Right intent.
right speech, right action, right work, right advance, right reflect, right focus.
Okay. So you have to practice that to keep your mind alert, your uh, your intent alert, mindful in a sense, to have the right speech, right action. It's like a work plan to help you stay in track. And we'll definitely find a different time to discuss uh, both the Eightfold Path and also the 12 dependent uh, origins of suffering. Okay, so today it's just a brief discussion because it's this whole month is the Sock month, which is what Buddha.
Buddha's. It's not.
Yeah,
Is his
Buddha birth.
birthday?
Yeah, it
Ah,
is. Yeah, the whole month, right? And so we celebrate him in his legacy, but his legacy is actually his teachings, right? It's not who he was as a person, but actually his legacy as a teacher who has so much wisdom that passed down for more than 2,600 years, right? So, and it's up to us to use it. If you don't use it, then it's such a waste, right? Wouldn't you think so, right? Right? It's so, but it is complicated and it is practical if you use it. Any question or challenge?
Um, in the beginning, when we were talking about the causations of suffering, we went through that they come from the three marks of existence: impermanence, self, non-self, and disorder. Both impermanence and non-self are kind of linked to each other. As people grow older, they are like experience a form of impermanence. Why separate the two?
Okay, good question. So it's the same thing if you go to a different religion or different, even different sect in Buddhism, right? Or if you don't encounter a person who is just have scientific mind, they can just call the whole thing reality. They can put everything into one bundle. It will be very difficult for a normal person to discern where certain issue come from when you break things down to compartments. Surely, if you are into Buddhism, you can break it down into further compartments to help uh, your friends or your family members, the next generation, to identify issues better. So to break them down into this, because if you take notice of the three mark of existence, they sound the same, very similar, just like law of Newton laws, right? Like very similar in terms of dynamics, right? But it each part has different functionality. It just helps you identify and understand yourself better. Same thing with the five attributes uh, to yourself, right? You can say everything is just one, just physical or mind, right? But Buddha broke it down to five parts just to help you categorize it and balance it better. But that's a different lesson for a different day. But good question. Anything? That's the question.
Well, so it's like impermanence is more about how it like the world around you is changing. Non-self is more about the human, like the human experience.
Correct. So if you go to Google or Wikipedia and you look at the second category of suffering, and that actually they call that suffering of existence. Just being who you are, being here is suffering. Um, but in Vietnamese we call that hoại khổ. That means not hoại khổ, hành khổ. That means formation of spirit, mental and physical habits, bad habits that will cause you suffering. Right. Okay.
So that makes sense why you would separate the two.
Yes. Yes. Right. So, but it all changes, right? One is also changing. The other one is also changing yourself. But the other one is more like changing of environment of different people,
Of situations.
situation, things like that. Your jobs, your career, things like that. Right. So, okay. Good question. Good question. Anything else?
No.
Okay. Well, with all that, I thank you so much for your time. I think it's a little bit long. All right. Until next time, I'll see you later. Thank you, Quy.